Good evening. Let's talk about Noah's flood for a little while tonight. You got a little echo? How's that sound to everybody? Sounds good. All right. Noah's flood by the numbers. All of us are probably familiar with Noah's flood, I would say. Even the youngest among us, because it's such a fascinating story. By the way, Johnny, are you looking for prayer cards? Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. But when I look at this account, knowing that a lot of people say, oh, it's just myth and legend, it didn't really happen, it's some kind of an analogy. But analogies, myths, legends don't get recorded like Noah's flood got recorded in very specific terms. Let's talk about some of these things here in Genesis chapter 5, because this is where the chronology starts from Adam all the way up to Noah. Check it out. Adam was 130 when he had Seth. How'd you like to start a family at 130? I personally think that's a pretty good idea. So maybe by that time we would know enough to say, okay, we're ready to have a kid. Let's have some children. So that's when Seth was born. You remember Seth was the one through whom the lineage would be counted after Cain killed Abel. Seth was 105 when he had Enosh. Enosh, you get it, 90 when he had Kenan, all the way down to Noah. Lamech was Noah's dad, and he had Noah when he was 182, and this is a total of 1,056 years. You can count it up for yourself. What I'm saying by this is God gives us a chronology right there in the Scriptures. He doesn't mess around. He doesn't leave room for multiplied thousands or millions or billions of years to be inserted into His chronology. He says this is the way it was. Here's how old these guys were when they had their children. And you can read that right on down through the list, and you come to a year of 1,056 when Noah was born. And Noah was 500 years old when he became the father of his own boys. And later on we'll find out that Shem was probably 97 at the time of the flood because he had his first son 2 years after the flood, and the flood lasted for a year. You keeping up with me so far? All right, good. So we're talking about early in Earth's history. This idea about Shem, this is information given us, and it's very specific information. It's not like God says, I had a flood come, and I had a guy build a boat, and he saved all the animals, and that's enough of that. No, he got very specific, and here's what we're talking about. So if Noah was 500 years old when he became the father of his boys, and the flood came when Noah was in his 600th year of life, and Shem was 97 at the time of the flood. That means when God decided to flood the earth, He said, a man, his days shall be 120 years. So if Noah was 600 years at flood time, and he became a dad at 500, God's decision would have been made 20 years prior to Noah having his first son. Now, I know we don't normally think in terms of this. We just think, well, Noah had 3 boys, and God said to him and his 3 boys, you guys need to build an ark, and this is how big you need to make. But that's not the way it happened. We don't know exactly when God contacted Noah. That's nothing that the text tells us. It just says that at some point God decided He was going to destroy the earth. He indicated that it would be 120 years into the future. And then He tells us that the flood came in Noah's 600th year. So if Noah was 600 years of flood time and he became a dad at 500, God's decision would have been made 20 years before Noah and the missus had their first boy. We up to snuff so far? Are you keeping notes? Is this all brand new information? I never thought about it like that before, because the way it's presented, you just have to look at it and figure these things out. So the ark, its dimensions, most of us are probably familiar with them. It was 300 cubits long, which is about 450 feet. And I'll also say before we get reading the rest of these, there is some discussion over exactly how long the cubit was, and the bottom line is we don't know. We don't know. Estimates range from between like 17 and a half inches to 20 and a half inches, right around in there. That's ballpark. I generally use 18 inches as the length of a cubit because that's what a cubit was back in the day, the more recent days when they actually used cubits. So that's what I'm going by tonight. I don't think it was widely different from that at all. There's no evidence that it was. So it was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. It had 3 decks, 1 door, and 1 window. That's how God told Noah to build it, and the instructions are right there in chapter 6, verses 14 to 16. There's a little more information there if you want to read it. By the way, never hesitate to read from the Scriptures what we're talking about up here. This is Genesis chapter 6, verse 14. God said to Noah, "Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood." And we also don't know exactly what gopher wood was, but guess who did know? Noah knew what gopher wood was. If he didn't, he could just go down to Lowe's and ask down there. They know. Maybe that's where he got his wood. I don't know. Well, actually, I do. He didn't get it at Lowe's. Make an ark of gopher wood. You'll make the ark with rooms, and you shall cover it inside and out with pitch, like tar. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark will be 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top. Set the door of the ark in the side of it, and you shall make it with the lower, second, and third decks. Wouldn't you like to have a picture of that, or at least an inspired drawing, so we could say this is exactly how the ark looked? There is a recreation, a rendition of the ark in Kentucky. Anybody been there who's here tonight? All right, several people have. And I would encourage you to go there and take a look. It's very impressive when you're at a distance, because the way they've done it is they have a place where you drive in and you park, and there's a building where you buy your tickets and you get on the bus to go over to where the ark is. But from there you can look, and there's a little kind of a swale or a valley, and then you come up the other side, and on another rise they have built the ark, and you can see it at a distance, and it's like, wow, that thing is massive. Well, they built it to the dimensions, within the dimensions of the size of a cubit. So it's life size. When you go there should be a little sign that says, the ark you see is actual size. Because that's, and I think there are signs that say that, but I missed them. At any rate, that's impressive, the size of the ark. There were only 8 people, of course, but we can only guess at the world's population at the time. And you can imagine how widely the estimates vary. But there may have been several million people on the earth, because we're talking about 1,000 years after the creation, and we're talking about people who lived, did not die until very late ages. So there were probably a lot of people around who were in their mature years of 400, 500 years old. I know that sounds like we're making a joke, but that's the history that God is providing for us. How could that be? I'm not really sure. But I do know there are plenty of theories that make perfect sense, that the world was a very different place before the flood, and that the differences between the way it is now and the way it was then were such that the oxygen would have been greatly increased, the pressure on the Earth's surface would have been greatly increased, and so every time you took in a lungful of air, you got a big lungful of fresh oxygen, because the environment would have pushed it into your lungs. That's the way it works now. We think we draw in air, but we're not actually drawing in air. What's happening is your lungs are expanding, and the outside pressure is pushing air in. That's the way it works. And the pressure at that time would have pushed in more oxygen than we're getting now. Oxygen is fuel for the body, and everything would have grown to be larger. By the way, when we dig up the animals from before the flood, how do they range in size and compare in size to what we have today? They were bigger. They were bigger. Beavers the size of modern-day bears. Bears the size of hippopotamus. I mean, this big animals. Moose, the Irish elk, what a big. They just uncovered the head of one of those things. I read not too long ago. But bigger animals, because things were probably very different then. Animals, there were 2 by 2 of each kind. There were probably around 5,000 different kinds. You don't have to have every variety of dog. You just have to have one pair of dogs that has the genes that would create all the varieties that there are today, and that's probably all you needed. One dog kind, one cat kind, everything came from a kind, and that's exactly what we're reading in Genesis chapter 1. Everything reproduced how? After its kind. You don't go from one kind to another, you stay within the kinds. So much that if you get just a little bit out, like a mule, what's a mule? That's when you cross a horse and a donkey. How do mules have babies? They don't. Did you hear that resonating answer? because they're sterile. So things don't reproduce outside their kind. They reproduce within their kind. And there are genetics available for one pair of dogs to have all the kinds of dogs that are on the earth today. That's the way it works. Of the clean animals and birds, they were taken in by sevens. What were the clean animals? God didn't at that time provide a list. After the flood, nobody needed to know what the clean animals were. Only Noah and his family at that time needed to know what the clean animals were. They knew. We don't need that information. It'd be interesting, but we don't need that information. Now, when God gave Moses the law in Leviticus chapter 11, no, not chapter 11. What chapter is it? Leviticus, is it 16? What's the chapter with all the list of the clean and unclean animals? There's your research question for next week. At any rate, those might be the same animals, but they may not be. It might be a completely different list. But Noah knew what the clean animals were. Those were brought on the ark, and the birds rather, by sevens as well. This is all in a minimum of 60,000 square feet of floor space. And this is a very pessimistic estimate. In other words, I'm sure it was larger than 60,000 square feet of floor space. If you take the dimensions of the ark, and they wouldn't be any smaller than what I've provided tonight, and then you multiply one floor by 3 floors, you get that number, which is the equivalent of 30 2,000 square foot barns. Anybody got a 2,000 square foot barn? That's a pretty good sized barn. You got 30 barns that size, well, that's what they had on the ark. And I was fascinated. I thought, what's the internal size of a standard railroad box car? You know that it just took a couple of Google clicks and I was there. I had pictures of them and everything and all their dimensions. I don't know if people are trying to sell box cars or what, but there's a lot of interesting information online these days. And with that information, I figured that very pessimistically, there were the equivalent of 133 standard box cars, that much room on the ark. That's quite a bit of space. Also, I'll just throw this in. People say, well, how did they get those great big huge dinosaurs on the ark? Well, if you're taking animals to start over with, would you take the great big mature ones? Or would you take the little smaller baby ones? I think they would have taken the smaller ones. Most dinosaurs were not that big anyway. They were smaller, about the size of a chicken. Really, when you start looking at the different kinds of dinosaurs, most of them were small. But the ones that were big, they could have taken the very, very young. All those things hatched out of eggs anyway. You could have just taken some very baby ones and had them on the ark with plenty of plenty of room to spare. Noah moved into the ark 7 days prior to the flood. Took a lot of preparation to put everything on board, of course, because God told Noah to put food on the ark for him, his family, and for the animals. And they got all that stuff on board. They got their furniture, whatever they needed, their TVs, color television sets, and cable stuff, and all that. They got all that put on the ark 7 days prior. They moved in, just like you would move into a house. But I used to wonder, why did God tell them to go in the ark 7 days before? Well, this is what I believe is to be understood by this. They didn't go in and sit down. They moved their stuff in because they're transitioning now from living on the earth that's about to be destroyed in an ark that's going to be floating above the earth that's going to be flooded with water. So they go in 7 days prior, and when the flood began, it rained 40 days and 40 nights. If you know the song, God told Noah, build him an arky. Yeah, you know the song. Rained and poured for 40 nights and days. It nearly drove those animals crazy. Now, I don't know that that's in the, actually I do know, it's not in the book. It doesn't say it drove those animals crazy, but it works real good in the kids' song. So, you ever wonder about that? Should we teach kids things like that in songs? Drove those animals crazy. I don't know. Bible doesn't say that. But it does say this, that it covered the highest peak by 15 cubits. How high is 15 cubits? We're talking between 20 and 25 feet over the highest peak that then was. And we do not know how high the peaks were at that time because there was probably a great deal of tectonic plate movement. If you don't know what tectonic plates are, come back next week. Yeah, right, okay. Probably you've heard of tectonic plates. Those are the massive plates of land underneath the surface of the earth that move and shift. And some of those things buckle a little bit, move a little bit, and that's why we have tsunamis and earthquakes and those kinds of things. But with all of God's power, if he spoke everything into existence, causing a flood would not be a problem. The Psalm 104, says that the lower places rose up and the high places came down. And you think about that, all the water that's in the oceans right now. If God caused the floor of the ocean to rise up and the mountains to be lowered by the movement of tectonic plates, it wouldn't be hard at all to cover the earth with water. And so he did cover it, and the highest peak was covered by 15 cubits. And the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. Now you and I, we would be fascinated by accounts of what life was like on the ark. Any amens to that? I would like to read about that. What was their day-to-day situation like? Were the animals sleeping? Probably not altogether sleeping, because they were supposed to put food on the ark for the animals, so they had to be awake at least at some point to eat that food. But maybe they did sleep a lot. We just don't know. We're not given that information. We don't need that. But these are the things we are told, that eventually the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat in the 7th month and the 17th day of the month. By the way, backing up a little bit, when it says in the 2nd month of what? Did you catch, or have you ever caught, that at that point in time, God was using Noah's age as the gauge for time? Look at chapter 7. Chapter 7, verse 11 of Genesis. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And on that very same day, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the sons of Noah, Noah's wife, and his 3 wives, and his sons entered the ark. God is gauging time now at this point based on Noah's age. He's 600 years old. So in the 600th year, 2nd month, 17th day, fountains of the great deep burst open. By the way, I didn't include any of that specific information because it doesn't have to do so much with the numbers. But it's very interesting when you look at a map of the seafloor, you'll see this massive line that goes all the way through the seafloor, through the Pacific and the Atlantic. And there are 2 mountain ranges down there on the bottom. And what they are is 2 ranges side by side. Now, where do you get 2 ranges side by side parallel to each other? The Hebrew word is cleaved. The water's cleaved. There was water below the ocean floor, and that water burst through at the word of God, and that water bursting through is what pushed up those 2 mountain ranges on the floor of the sea. You can Google maps of the sea floor, and you can see those 2 ranges running side by side parallel all the way down through the Pacific and all the way through the Atlantic, which is evidence of exactly what God is telling us in Genesis, that those fountains burst through, created those mountain ridges down there, and everything on the surface of the earth changed. The waters decreased until the tops of the mountains could be seen on the 10th month and the 1st day of the 10th month. And I wondered about this because I thought, well, if the mountains of Ararat is where the ark rested, there has to be some land, it seems, there has to be some land visible. Maybe the ark rested in a place, the only place where there was some land visible. It was one of the taller peaks of what was left of the mountains of Ararat. And after the ark rested, in time the waters receded some more and more mountain peaks were seen. Perhaps that's what we're meant to understand here. Whatever we're meant to understand, I want us to see that God is documenting everything very precisely by time. This isn't the kind of record that you give someone when you're just making it up as you go. This is very precise, very accurate. When you're going to court and you want evidence, this is the kind of testimony that you want to go to court with. You want somebody who says, it was the 3rd day of August at 2:15 in the afternoon. And I know that because I've got this document right here that shows that, and this is when he punched out, and whatever. If you've got that kind of evidence, you know you've got a solid case, and that's what God is doing here. He's being very specific and very careful to be specific about the times of all these occurrences. Post-flood, after the flood, second part of the post-flood, Noah sent out a raven after 40 days, but it apparently did not return. it could fly, and that's what it sounds like the text is saying that it did. It just flew, perhaps on thermals or whatever, but it did not return, is what seems to be indicated there. And it doesn't say this in the text, but if there's anything dead floating, a raven could land on that and make a good meal. That's what they're doing, by the way, when you drive up and down the roads here in Choctaw and you see those ravens out in the road picking at a dead carcass. That's what they eat all the time. You'd think they'd be a lot fatter than they are, because we got plenty of dead carcasses all over the place. But that was a raven that God sent out, and it didn't come back. A dove was sent out, and it didn't find any place to rest, and so that dove returned. 7 days later, he sent out the dove again, and it came back with fresh olive leaves, which would indicate to Noah, okay, there's plenty of dry land out there. The olive leaves are available for this dove to pick. And 7 days later, he sent out the dove again, and that time it did not return. That's all from Genesis chapter 8, verses 6 through 9. The water dried up in the 601st year, in the first month. And what I believe this means is that the waters receded to the point where the land was no longer inundated by water, but the land itself was apparently not dry until the second month and the 27th day of that month. By the way, if you remember when the flood started, this is a year and 10 days after the flood started. Genesis 8:1 says this, and here are the conclusions that I'm going to draw tonight, just 4 of them here. That God remembered Noah. We look at all these details, but the important thing to Noah was God remembered him. Does God remember us? Oh yeah. When the flood comes, that's when God, I believe, remembers us most. When times are good, God is there. When times are bad, God is there. Our knowledge of Him, our sense of His being and His presence doesn't have anything to do with it. Sometimes you'll talk to people and they'll say, and we might feel like this ourselves, well, God has just forgotten me. God doesn't know what's going on in my life. No, He always knows. There's never a time when He's not aware. There's never a time that He doesn't care. And so when I read in the text that God remembered Noah, I almost want to say, as I read that and I think about it, I want to say, well, duh. This whole account is about God remembering Noah. God didn't begin to remember Noah in chapter 8, verse 1. God had been remembering Noah all along. God had been recognizing Noah's faith all along. So, yes, God remembered Noah, and He remembers you and me as well. He will never forget us. He will never forsake us. He will never leave us. The record shows that Noah did according to all that God had commanded him. How important is that for us to learn? What do you think would have happened if Noah would have said, you know what, we don't have enough room or enough wood to make it 300 cubits. I think I'll stop at 275. Now, we can speculate all day long about whether or not the ark would have floated. That's not the point. The point is that Noah did what God gave him to do, and he and his family were preserved by his obedience. And that's what Hebrews chapter 11 says. Noah's faith saved him. When you read in Hebrews chapter 11, this is a record of the faithful. And when you get to chapter 12, in the 12th chapter, the writer is going to refer to the great cloud of witnesses. And among this great cloud of witnesses is Noah. And this is what the writer says of Noah in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence, prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. Now it's interesting when it says, by faith, being warned of God about things not yet seen. What's that mean? What do you think that has reference to? When you go back to Genesis, the early chapters, it doesn't say there was ever rain. It says a mist came up from the ground and watered everything. So by the time we get to Noah, there's no indication in Scripture that had changed. Probably people had never seen rain. There was enough moisture coming up from the ground to water everything so that the world was lush and green. And by the way, what is coal? I know I've asked this question before, but I want to keep asking it to make a point. Coal is the remains of organic life that has been quickly buried and compressed. It takes about if I remember the specifics, it takes about 20 feet of organic material to make 1 foot of coal. And you can read about coal seams. There's one, where is it? Is it in? I shouldn't guess because I'll be wrong. But I remember reading about a coal seam that is 200 feet thick. That's a lot of organic material. Where is coal found? It's deep in the earth. I grew up in southern West Virginia where they dig those mines and they go way down into the ground to find coal. How did all that organic material get down there? It was the flood. What do we find besides coal? We find fossils. Ken Ham is the guy who made famous the saying about fossils. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the world. And what would we expect if there was a worldwide flood? We would expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers that were laid down by water all over the world, because those rock layers weren't rock layers when they were laid down. It was waterborne sediment, and that sediment eventually became stone. That's what sediment does when you compress it. It becomes stone. So Noah's faith saved him, but he still had to build the ark. Same thing today. Our faith saves us. So let's all just go home and watch TV. Our faith saves us, and that ought to compel us, as Paul writes in Ephesians, to be about good works for God, because he has saved us from our own sin. All aboard the ark were saved by water. This is an interesting statement made by Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, and it's kind of a run-on sentence, but he says this in verse 18. For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God. That's why he died, to bring us to God. Having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits that are now in prison, who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Now this is the New American Standard, brought safely through the water. Anybody got a King James? How does the King James read? Anybody got it? King James says they were saved by water. When you look up different translations, the ones that are actually translations rather than paraphrases, most of them say saved by water. When I was a kid, I thought that was weird. What would you think saved Noah and his family? I would have thought the ark, that big boat that's what saved them, but not from God's perspective. From God's perspective, what was destroyed by the flood? The world of sin. That's what they were being saved from. They weren't being saved from the flood. Noah and his family were being saved from the sin. And the flood itself was the mechanism through which God saved them. That's what Peter is saying. What does he liken that to in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 20 and 21? We haven't read verse 21 yet, but he says this, the like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us. As Noah and his family were saved from the sinful world by the flood, what did the flood do? It bore them up while they were in the ark, bore them up and wiped out the sin. And that's what happens for us at baptism. We are borne up by the waters of baptism, our sins are washed away, and we are preserved by that water. Well, I don't know what you think of this lesson, but all I really know is I'm concerned about what God thinks about it. So I hope you and God agree that these are things we need to always consider and keep in mind. This has been Noah's flood by the numbers, but what I'm hoping is that if we ever talk about Judgment Day by the numbers, you'll be among the number who, like Noah, kept the faith, obeyed the Lord, and wound up on the right side of judgment. We're going to stand and sing a song of encouragement. And if you, like Noah, need to put your trust in God, if you need to get in the ark, which today would be the church, this is the time to do it. We're going to invite you to do that while we stand and sing the invitation song together.
Praise